Welcome back to Chapter 5, Early Childhood Body of Knowledge. Today, we're exploring the absolute wild journey of how a tiny, babbling toddler somehow turns into a thinking, feeling human being. I mean, have you ever watched a little kid throw a massive tantrum or ask why for literally the 100th time and just wondered what on earth is going on inside their head? Well, researchers have actually spent decades figuring that out, and it turns out early childhood is the absolute most critical time for brain development in a person's entire life. So by looking at how these little guys grow, develop, and learn, we can figure out the best ways to actually support them. Let's dive right into this explainer and map out our lecture for today. We're going to cover 5 main steps: the growing brain, stages of thinking, social and emotional growth, how environments shape behavior, and finally, learning through play. All right, Section 1. We are starting right at the biological source, the growing brain. It is the absolute foundation for everything else we're going to talk about today. Okay, take a look at this staggering number right here, 90%. 90% of a child's brain connections are completely built by the time they are just 3 years old. I mean, really think about that for a second. Before they even step foot into kindergarten, their brain's physical wiring is mostly in place. It's wild. Every single time they play, talk, or just interact with a caring adult, they are literally building brand new pathways in their brain. And here's what that wiring actually looks like up close. When a kid experiences something new, their brain forms synapses. You can kind of think of them as little microscopic bridges connecting ideas. Positive interactions make these bridges super strong. But here's the catch. If certain bridges aren't used, they just die off. It's a natural biological process called pruning. So it's literally a use it or lose it situation inside a growing mind. Moving right along to Section 2, Stages of Thinking. So now that we've got the physical brain wired up, how does a child actually start to process the world around them? Well, a famous researcher named Jean Piaget taught us that kids aren't just, many adults who simply know less than we do. They actually think in totally different ways depending on how old they are. He mapped out these 4 strict stages of development. And the biggest rule here, it's honestly exactly like leveling up in a video game. You have to beat level 1 before you can even think about moving to level 2. A kid just cannot skip a stage no matter how smart they are. They've got to build that one level of understanding before moving to the next. Another way to think about it is like a computer, or really an old smartphone. A young child's short-term working memory is extremely small. It acts like this super narrow bottleneck. If you throw too many instructions at a kid all at once, kind of like having way too many apps open on an old phone, their brain just jams up. It freezes. So we have to help them focus on just one thing at a time, so that information can actually squeeze through that bottleneck and settle into their long-term memory. But hey, kids aren't just tiny computers, right? They feel and they interact, which brings us to Section 3, Social and Emotional Growth. So another researcher, Erik Erikson, mapped out these emotional milestones. He basically showed that early childhood is all about beating 4 major emotional challenges. First off, infants just have to figure out if they can trust the adults around them. Then, as toddlers, they want independence, that I can do it myself phase. After that, preschoolers start taking the initiative to really see how the world works. And finally, older kids just want to master new skills and feel competent. And the key here? Adults absolutely have to be there to support them through every single one of those phases. Now, you might hear this super fancy education term from a theorist named Lev Vygotsky. It's called the zone of proximal development. I know, it sounds ridiculously complicated, right? But what does that actually mean for us when we're, say, trying to teach a kid something brand new? Honestly, it just means finding their learning sweet spot. It's that little gap between what a kid can do completely by themselves and what they can pull off if an expert, like you, helps them just a tiny bit. We help them cross this gap using something called scaffolding. It's exactly like putting training wheels on a bike. You give them that support so they feel brave enough to try. And then, once they get the hang of it, you just take the wheels off so they can ride solo. All right, moving into Section 4, Environments and Behavior. Because, as we know, a child doesn't just grow up in a vacuum. They're heavily shaped by the outside world. Theorist Yuri Bronfenbrenner pictured this kind of like Russian nesting dolls, these different circles of influence that just surround the child. So right at the tightest center, you've got their family and school. Then the next circle out is how that family and school actually interact with each other. Further out, you've got bigger things like maybe the parents' jobs. And then the absolute biggest outer circles are society's cultural values and even how things change over time. Basically, to really get why a kid acts a certain way, you've got to look at all of these swirling environments together. Now, when we want to understand how behavior actually changes in those environments, we usually look at two main ideas. First up is classical conditioning. That's basically linking an automatic physical reaction to a totally random neutral trigger. And the second one is operant conditioning. That's when you actively shape a behavior using rewards, like praise or maybe a piece of candy, or on the flip side, using punishments. And here is a perfect example of classical conditioning in action, Pavlov's famous dog experiment. So Pavlov proved that a dog could actually learn to link the totally random sound of a bell with dinner time. Pretty soon, literally just hearing the bell made the dog drool, even when there was zero food around. It's exactly like when the 3 p.m. school bell rings and you just automatically start packing up your backpack, right? So think about it. If a kid associates a classroom with feeling bad, they might just automatically feel anxious the second they walk through the door. And that brings us to our final part, Section 5, Learning Through Play. Let's see what all these heavy theories about brain growth and behavior actually look like when you drop them into a real-world classroom. John Dewey, who was this massive thinker in education, firmly believed that true learning absolutely does not happen by just sitting still and staring at a boring worksheet. He famously said children learn by doing. For him, education has to be based on real active experiences that actually mean something to the student. And we see this doing in action in a couple of really cool ways today. Like on the left, you've got the Montessori method. These classrooms are totally child-sized, and kids use these very specific hands-on materials to learn totally independently. Then on the right is the STREAM approach that stands for science, technology, reading, engineering, arts, and math. This one is all about messy, hands-on problem solving. Think like building a wooden toy truck from scratch. But both of these methods prove the exact same point. Kids learn best when they're actively sitting in the driver's seat.
But before we go, we do have to remember one very serious warning here: toxic stress. And I'm not talking about just being nervous for a math test. I mean long-term, continuous, severe stress. Because that kind of stress can literally destroy those fragile early brain connections we talked about at the very beginning. So, knowing how unbelievably fast a toddler's brain grows, the ultimate question I have for you today is this. Whether you end up as a future parent, a teacher, or just an older sibling, what role are you going to play in protecting and nurturing the minds of the next generation? Really think about that as we wrap up today's explainer. See you next time.